You seeing what I saw you? Good deal. Certainly thankful to see everybody in our auditorium class this evening. Of course, we're staying in the same line of thoughts and looking at the same book material that Joel selected for us here a few weeks back, and we're looking at a primary question that's asked as to how do you handle various things. We've already looked at some of those, and we're going to continue on tonight with looking at how you handle well, maybe you don't. Failure. How do you handle failure? Failure. And of course, hopefully we established the fact from the very beginning that what we're seeking to do in this study is to realize there's a whole lot of things that we face in life, good, bad, and ugly, but the real when the rubber meets the road is what we do when we do face those things, because they're certainly to come our way. And so we're looking sometimes at both sides of the same issue, and certainly we talked about how do you handle success, so the very opposite then would be how do you handle failure. Now, of course, as is the case with just about anything, in order to actually delve into something so significant as this, we sort of need to define our terms, because, believe it or not, there are some people who would define such things as failure differently than other people might define their terms like failure. And we'll see that even as the case in the Bible, because all things do not fit in the same category as it relates to failure. So here, let's look at some dictionary definitions here that I've provided for you to see on the screen here. Maybe I can see that far back. Obviously, we're going to have a little bit of English lesson too. Believe it or not, failure is a noun. That means it's not a verb, although it could be verbalized, I guess, by using the form of the word. But we're talking about a noun. So here's the first definition provided. The condition or fact of not achieving the desired end or ends. And then the example would be in the sentence, the failure of an experiment. Now, as far back as I can remember in science classes at Squatch County High School, is that there were various theories that you put to the test to determine whether the theory was in fact acceptable or not to base further study on. And of course, if you did some type of experiment on a matter and you did it over and over and over again, and you came up with the same conclusion, while as far as that particular experiment was concerned, then it was a failure because it did not result in what we thought might happen, okay? But even in that sense of the term being used there, I would not call that experiment a failure in a point-blank, black and white way, because it was eliminating what could have possibly been the answer, and now we're just doing what we can to try to go to something that might be more valuable. I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Albert Einstein, but somebody along that same line said that there's thousands of failures before you do come up with the right thing. But all those failures are getting you away from the things that you're knowing that cannot contribute to what you're trying to be and get as a success. And so failure is part and parcel of that process. And keep that in mind as we'll look at these biblical examples here in a few minutes. Another definition under this same heading, one that fails, a failure at one's career. A person tried to do something to make money and to live off of and to provide for his family, but he fails in that regard. So that's the way we see the word failure used. Third one, the condition or fact of being insufficient or falling short. And of course, every year, if you're in the business of putting out a garden, then while last year it looked as though there was no way anybody could fail to have a good crop, then lo and behold, here comes the next year, and it seems as though nothing comes up. Now, this past year, my garden ended up being pretty good later on, but it was a complete failure because the varmints was eating everything that was springing up out of the ground. They were eating the seeds before they even had a chance to germinate. It was a failure, but I ate a bunch of tomatoes, and we ended up having some corn. I still got corn in my freezer. So while there were failures at times, I kept on replanting and replanting and replanting, and then finally there was success at the end of the road. And that's what life's about too, obviously. How many of us have been highly successful the first time we tried to do anything? or we have to just keep on going through and pushing through the failures. And of course, here is where that definition came from. So we're going to think about this from a biblical perspective. Go back to Genesis chapter 6, and we're first introduced to this man. His name is Noah, of course. Noah is identified as being the 8th man. I think I can put this on the screen there. Notice here in chapter on after the flood is fixing to take over the world, every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and the creeping things and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So, when you look at a good general overview of this man Noah, would you classify him as a failure? Only in a comparative subjective type way you would. I dare say if we could make it to heaven and take our families with us, then we would claim, and properly so, that we were somewhat successful, wouldn't you? And that's what we see here in the life of Noah. But we know, of course, from other passages, like over in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5, that Noah is pictured as being a preacher of righteousness. Did Noah ever have any converts? Not that we know of. You mean for 120 years here he is preaching, and he's identified as being a preacher of righteousness. He's speaking concerning what's fixing to take place on the human race. Evidently, people are listening to him, probably making fun of him, saying, "What do you mean, flood?" And of course, there's some reasoning that there had not even been any such thing as rain up to this moment in time. So how in the world are you going to get us to believe that there's going to be so much rain, of which we've never seen, that it's going to flood and everybody's going to drown? So all this supposed evidence they had before them, and they just simply could not believe that God was going to destroy man that he had created. And so what they heard Noah saying, they discounted it as foolishness. And all this building enterprise here, what are you doing, Noah? So there's 2 or 3 different ways you can look at his life and what he was engaged in doing. And of course, the point that's oftentimes made to gospel preachers from this example here is if nobody responds to the gospel, you're not a failure if you preach the gospel. If nobody changes their attitude and doesn't result in a change of action, your responsibility is simply preach the gospel. I mean, is that not what Paul, in fact, said in 1 Corinthians chapter 3? He said, "I planted, Apollos watered, and Paul gave the increase." That's not what he said. He says God gave the increase. And so the person who's doing what their responsibility is, as is the case here with Paul and Apollos, they're preaching the gospel, then that's dependent upon good and honest hearts to accept the gospel when it is preached so that they might be successful themselves. But a person is doing what he's supposed to be doing, then you do not determine his success rate or whether he's a failure or not as to how many people pay attention to him. I mean, think of how many people who enjoy, evidently, the inside of prison, that they keep going back time after time after time again. Why do they do that? Well, they choose to. You think it would leave some kind of impact on their life that they say, this just ain't the way to live. I need to change something here. I need to quit running around with the same people that end up in the same place that I am. But more often than not, they end up falling right back into the same habits, running with the same crowd, and end up in the same place because they still possess free moral agency. And of course, it would be interesting to hear someone that takes the position of the Calvinist, who we talked about extensively on Sunday. How would they explain the whole situation of people end up in jail anyhow? Well, we've already noticed that. They can't help it. They're not any worse than somebody who chooses not to break the law and ends up outside of jail. Everybody's in the same position. It's all molecules in motion, and you don't have any say-so on anything. Of course, that's contrary to common sense and obviously contrary to Bible sense. So I don't think that we would classify good old Noah as a failure just in the sense that he saved his family and he did what God told him to do, and that was to preach concerning the certain calamity of the flood that's coming his way. All right, another one. What about the account that the Lord tells us about in Luke chapter 15? This, of course, is a chapter of the lost things. You got the lost sheep, you got the lost coin, and then you've got the lost boy. But of course, in reality, at the end of the narrative, there's more than one lost boy. There's actually two lost boys. So the only thing different is that one lost boy never did leave his father's house, but he's just as lost as the prodigal is. Would you think, and looking at that situation, did the father of the prodigal, did he fail as a father? No. I mean, he made his own decisions, you know. He made his own bed, now he's got to lay in it, we say. Now you look at what ended up causing the young son to become a prodigal to begin with, you can begin to question, well, why did he end up doing and giving that boy what he wanted? Why did he do that? He should have stuck to his guns and said, no, you're not getting your inheritance. Pooey on you thinking that you'll be so old and wore out by the time I die that you won't be able to use the money that you're going to get from my inheritance to you, that you need to go ahead and get it now. We said, well, if he'd have dug his heels in, well, there'd have been turmoil in that household, obviously, the whole time. And so when he let the son have his way, then he came to himself, which means he was not thinking in the correct way when he went away with all this inheritance. And he wasted his substance in riotous living, of course. So we can't really hold the father responsible for the dumb decisions of the son. We might have said, well, I'd have held out a little bit more. I'd have made him pout for at least 2 years before I'd ever let him have what he thought he needed to have right then. Well, maybe so. But ultimately, you can't hold him responsible for the actions, the attitude and the actions of his son, for sure. And then, sort of in a contrast question, what about the fellow that we're introduced to in Luke chapter 12 that the Lord refers to as being a fool? Now, when you start to read this particular context, beginning at verse 13, remember there was two brothers that were squabbling over a piece of property. Evidently, they had inherited a piece of property from their parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or whatever. And one of them was not satisfied with the way it had been divided, and so he sought to get Jesus involved in making the decision and determination as to what ought to happen. And remember, Jesus said, go to the law. What does the law say? Go to somebody who deals with matters like this. This is not something I'm going to involve myself in. But then he said, beware, take heed, beware, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. So here was a problem here that existed with this boy, because he's afraid he was going to get not with what he was deserving to get. And so he's wanting the Lord to fix that matter up, when the Lord says, no, you've got courts to take care of situations like that, but you better be careful and not be so greedy and so covetous as to allow something like that to cause you to lose your soul. And then he told the story of this fellow that I've oftentimes identified as having his picture on the front page of Progressive Farmer magazine. He's got a great big old Massey Ferguson tractor. He's plowing 16 rows at a time. He's the president of the local farmers co-op. Everybody knows his name. Everybody is dependent on him because he's such a successful farmer. He's got the best cows, got the best horses, got the best everything there is to have. And yet, what ends up with him? He dies. He dies. Of course, this came on the heels of what him doing to take care of all the bounty that God had blessed him with. He had to tear down his what? His little old penny barns, and had to build bigger barns because he had done such an excellent job. He was such a genius. He was such a wonderful farmer that he thought the reason why he had all these things is because of him. Well, he didn't invent seed time and harvest. He didn't invent the rain to come and the sun to shine on his crops. He didn't do that. God did that. And so what Jesus said concerned him is he was a fool because he did not consider who's going to get this stuff after you die. Now that brings in an interesting conversation too, because you remember back in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon pictured a man who dies with a whole lot of stuff, but then he says, what happens when here's a fella who's been very frugal with what he's got, and he's invested wisely, and he's got all this stuff, and then he ends up dying, and his kids get the stuff, and they waste it because they're dumb. That's not right. That's when he would say that is vanity and vexation of spirit, you know. This is a terrible situation. Here's a fella who's slaved and worked hard, and then here's some sorry offspring that just waste what they are given. Well, that's not good either, is it? See? But here this man failed to realize that his life was going to be required of thee, and then the question that the Lord asked is, who's going to get all your stuff now? And as he uses the personal pronouns throughout his assessment of his situation, you know, look what I have done to my stuff, you know. It's everything me, 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 me. And so while he may have been a highly respected farmer in the community, may even held an office of farmers across the state in which he could have possibly lived, then he was a fool because he was not rich towards God. He was rich towards his own well-being. So successful, now here's a successful man. Would we actually classify him as successful in anything other than the ability to make money in farming? That's the only thing. You know, is that the main thing? Is that what should be our pursuit, is being able to do like that? Or is it something entirely different than that? Not saying that we are poor stewards or anything, but certainly he was misplaced in his priorities, and it showed. And he's identified as being a fool. And God identifies him that way. Why did he identify him that way? Because he was. He was a foolish man, even though he was probably highly respected among his peers. The next question, well, there's where that is. I'm sorry, I should have put that up there. Why is, here's a question that's, and all these questions and all these passages, of course, come in the little lesson that Joel has the book for. But here's one I want us to consider, and this is based upon Job chapter 4. Why is it sometimes hard to judge whether a person is a failure or not? Well, let's read this little section here that'll help us. Now, you recall that Job, after he's facing all the losses that he has experienced here, he's lost his family, he's lost all his animals, he's lost his servants, his male servants, female servants. He's lost everything. He's lost his health. The only thing he hadn't lost is his wife, and he's probably wishing that would have been the first thing he lost because of her telling him to curse God and die, because he shouldn't be suffering the indignities that he is, which was a wrong thing for her to say for sure. And then he happens to have three so-called friends. And here's this first friend that comes along, and notice what he says beginning at verse 1 of Job chapter 1. His name is Eliphaz. He's a Temanite. And he said, if we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? Now that's just another way of saying, Job, if we was to talk to you a little bit and try to figure this out with you, would you get upset with us doing that? Well, then he answers his own question, the next verse, when he says, but who can withhold himself from speaking? In other words, I've got to say something here. It's obvious that somebody needs to say something here, Job. And so what he ends up saying, of course, is not a very kind thing for him to say, but notice his reasoning anyhow. Beginning of verse 3, behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. So what this so-called friend is saying, Job, you know, in times past, you've been the very pillar that many of our friends have leaned on in difficult situations, sort of like the one that you're facing right now. You are an encouragement to people who are having the reverses in life thrown their way. And then he said, thy words have upholden him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. So here's obviously talking about the good character of Job in times past. He was somebody that others could lean on in times of difficulty. He continues in verse 5, but now it is come upon thee, and thou faintest. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Uh-oh. So he said, here we got reverses in life that have come your way now, Job. What are we going to do? How are we going to explain that? Is not this thy fear, thy confidence, thy hope, and the unrighteousness of thy ways? Now what he's saying here, he says, all right now, you know good and well the reason why you're facing this is because of you and what you've either failed to do or you've done that was contrary to God's will. Notice what he says in verse 7. Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? Now what's his attitude and what's the philosophy that he's living by here? The only way bad things happen is because you're a bad person. That's what Mr. Eliphaz is saying. The reason why you're suffering is because we didn't know it up to this point in time. I mean, from the outside looking in, you were a pillar in the community. You were a great guy. God had blessed you exceedingly with a wonderful family and all this money and all these herds of cattle and all that. But lo and behold, there was something secret that you were engaged in, and now you're suffering because of it. Because absolutely, there's no way bad things happen to good people. Well, that's a lie. But yet that's the explanation that this so-called friend throws at poor old Job. So you look at Job from that standpoint, and from what he says right here, obviously Job was a failure. It was secret for a while, but now it's out in the open. Obviously the reason why you're suffering is because you're a vile human being. Nobody could suffer like you're having to suffer, Job, except you're guilty of some terrible, terrible sin, or maybe a whole mountain full of sin. But that's not true. Now, isn't it amazing that the false gospel of health and wealth promotes the idea that if you simply do what God tells you to do, then you're not going to face any problems. And if you are facing problems, that's a sure indication you're not faithful. The only problem with that is every example of a genuine faithful person in the Bible who are not identified as faithful by human beings, but identified as faithful by God, they suffered problems. Now, some of those problems were their own doing, like David, But in many instances, it was in spite of the fact that they were faithful and godly people, they suffered anyhow. How do you explain that? Because we live in a world that is not fair. It's not fair. I mean, if we had our druthers, the only people that would suffer any type of reverse at all would be wicked people. But we know that's not the case. Have you ever known any godly people who got cancer and died early in life? Do you know of any godly people who had car accidents and maybe lost a limb or maybe even their life? Well, that's not right. That's not fair. Why did that happen? It's because you live in a sin-cursed world. That's why. The natural laws that are oftentimes broken through no fault of our own end up causing us great harm. I saw just this week where this boy and girl were out at some scenic overlook somewhere, and the guy got down on his knee and pulled out a ring and proposed to the girl. She became so startled, she stepped back and fell to her death 150 feet. That ain't right. That shouldn't have happened. One of the most wonderful things could have happened in her life, and there she's dead because of it. Well, what was God going to do? Suspend gravity for her? Well, according to thinking like this knucklehead here, that's what should have happened. He should have thrown a net in her way so she wouldn't have fallen. She didn't do anything to deserve falling off the side of that mountain. The very idea. Maybe it's her future husband's fault for even taking her there to propose to her. No, it was an accident. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to rotten people. That's why we should not become so enamored with this world, because that's the way this world is. Remember the first time I had a car wreck, and it was simply because I looked down for 2 seconds, and all of a sudden when I looked back up, and of course it was raining, the car in front of me had stopped at the red light, right here in good old Dunlap, Tennessee, when we just used to have one. And I mean, I was so upset. How did I do that? How did I do that? And the cop said, that's why they call it an accident, Freddie. Says, oh yeah, it's an accident. Should I have been not looking down, probably changing the radio, you know? Well, of course, shouldn't have been doing that. But was that an attack on my faithfulness because I foolishly looked down? Did God cause that to happen? Well, no. Time and chance happens to us all. And so figuring out whether a person is in fact successful or not, sometimes impossible for us to know. If we're going to make a judgment call based upon the circumstances that people have to deal with and say, because they're facing those circumstances, then obviously they're not right with God, then you're acting and talking like this foolish Temanite here by the name of Eliphaz. He was wrong as he could be. And that's not the kind of help that Job needed at this time either, you know. Is somebody accusing him thusly. All right, the next one. Well, I'm sorry I didn't do that one. No one is a failure who does what? And we'll just leave that wide open and won't even tell you what passage of Scripture is associated with that. But what would you think would fit into the category of an explanation as to a person not being a failure if they do what? What would you say would be the what? Live faithfully. If a person lives faithfully, then they're going to be successful, even if the whole world thinks they're failures. And oftentimes they look upon people who are simply faithful, don't have anything going for them other than that. But they're successful nonetheless. And of course, the wise man Solomon was the one that penned this at the end of chapter 12. What did old Solomon try to do? He tried to find happiness and success and fun and merriment in anything and everything the world had to offer. He tried to get it through women, wasn't there. Tried to get it through wine, wasn't there. Tried to get it through songs. He wrote a bunch of songs, wasn't there. He tried to get it in building things. He built a lot of stuff, wasn't there. He tried to get it in gardens and vineyards and trees, fruit trees, wasn't there. He tried to get leaving an impression on foreign dignitaries to the point that the Queen of Sheba said the half has not been told of the glory of his kingdom, but wasn't there. So when he finally, after going through all that stuff, said, here's the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, that's reverence and respect God, and do his bidding, for this is man's all. That's what the New King James says. If you'll notice, and we pointed this out before, and it's good to know it, in the King James or any other reliable translation, if a word is provided that's not found in the original text, it's in italics. So if you'll look at this verse, duty is in italics, which means it's not in the text. It's simply been provided to make the verse read more smoothly. So what does the wise man Solomon actually say? This is the whole of man. It's not a half. It's not 3/4. It's not 5/6. It's not 7/8. Not 9/10. No, it's the all of man. If you're doing that right there, reverencing and respecting God and doing what the Lord says do, then you are a success. Doesn't have anything to do with how much money you've got in the bank or what you live in or what you drive or how many people call you wonderful. Doesn't have anything to do with that. Now, we would rather have it where people spoke well of us in spite of the fact that we didn't have all those things, but that really doesn't matter. What matters is having our priorities in order, as Solomon ultimately said. Yes, sir.
Most people don't judge people's success because they don't see them get the things, all these things in this life.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But so Solomon's looking at that. He's getting all these things, right? But he saw that the one thing that they all had in common, all the ones that are getting all these things in this life, was they died.
Yes.
And then where did the things go?
Yeah.
Went to somebody else.
Yeah.
All the things they strived and worked for their whole life didn't mean anything. But, striving and working for a heavenly reward, it's everlasting.
Exactly. Exactly. He uses not only the sad example of a fellow who's worked like a dog his whole life to provide for his family and all, and then he dies and a foolish son wasted all. But he also said, here's an individual who doesn't do anything but bad his whole life, and here's a person who's done nothing but good all his life. and yet both of them end up dying. Well, that ain't right, you know. The good and the bad both die, and even the ugly. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We just keep coming back to Clint Eastwood all the time, don't we? Everybody dies, you know. So what really matters is not, we're going to die. But what matters is how you live. Because that's going to determine where you'll be in eternity for sure. And Solomon, of course, as we pointed out, he was the person that if anybody could have found success, happiness, fulfillment, and satisfaction with what the world has to offer, it'd have been him. I mean, he couldn't do it. He was the wisest man, the most powerful man, the richest man, and yet he couldn't get it. It wasn't there. There was nothing fulfilling, lasting, and providing satisfaction. But knowing that you die faithful and you're going home to glory, that's the icing on the cake right there. And he learned that after a long time for sure. How did David handle his failures? Well, there's a whole lot of failures for him to have to handle, obviously. What is one of the particular failures that stands out in your mind about David? Do what? Number the people. That was a dumb thing for him to do, but he did it nonetheless. And of course, one of the reasons why you're not supposed to number the people is because that's like you're dependent on the people, and the more the people, then the more powerful you are. That was wrong. Had David not ever heard the story of Gideon and his 300? Of course. So that was wrong. So he didn't have confidence in God to be on their side. If you and God are a majority, regardless of how many millions are on the other side, that's what has to be learned. Most of the time, we would think about that wandering eye of David when his army is out fighting battles and he's wasting time in his apartment. He looks out the door and looks out the window and sees a woman taking a bath, and he lusts after her, and he calls for her, and he ends up having a child conceived by her, and then he ends up trying to cover that up by having her real husband killed. What a cutthroat. So how did he respond to that? Well, when it was brought to his attention right here, when Nathan told him the story of this rich man who had all these abundance of sheep, and lo and behold, there was one poor guy who had this little lamb that lived in the house with him. It was like a daughter to him, it says. You know, some people look at cats like that and dogs like that as part of the family. Well, so when somebody comes to visit, the rich man goes over and gets that little old lamb of the poor man and kills it, and that's what they eat. How did David respond to that story that Nathan told him? He got mad, didn't he? He said, "What are you talking about? You point out this sorry fellow right here, and I'll have him killed." And what did Nathan say? "Thou, you're the man. It's you. Me." I mean, we look at that and say, how could he be so blind as not know the end of the story before Nathan has to tell him? How come he can't see that? He couldn't see it. He really couldn't see it. But when he did, here's what he had to say. Nathan said to David, "The Lord also hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die." It came on the heels of him repenting and saying, "I've sinned against God. I've sinned against Bathsheba. I've sinned against Uriah the Hittite. I've sinned against thee." Now, so did that take care of the problem right then and there? Were there any other consequences that came in addition to this attitude of change on the part of David? Well, just so happened a little bit later, we know that baby that was conceived died, was sick, and David besought the Lord, prayed, fasted for all this period of time, and then lo and behold, the baby died. So, you know the next offspring that was born to David and Bathsheba, you know what they named him? Nathan. Man, that'd be the last thing I'd name him. No, every time, "Nathan, get in here. Come here." Then he's thinking about what a sorry thing he did. And Nathan brought it to his attention, and rightfully so. And so it's where we get the assurance that while that baby died, there's no way he can bring that baby back, but he can go to that baby, which is encouraging encouraging thing for those who have lost loved ones. They can go to them if they are faithful. How about Judas? Would you say Judas was a failure? Boy, I sure would. How did he deal with this failure? He hung himself of all things. He came to the temple. He took that 30 pieces of silver that he had been paid to show who the Lord was and allow him to be taken and crucified. He threw that silver down at their feet and he went and hanged himself. Was that the right way to deal with failure? Did it fix it? Well, of course not. It compounded the problem. Compounded the problem. You probably know of situations in which individuals simply could not face, they didn't think, the consequences of dumb things that they did, and they thought this was an easy route to escape the disgust that people would heap on them because of the decisions they made. You probably know of people like that. I know of a gospel preacher who was found out to be running around with a secretary. And when the elders called him in, he went to the building before they got there, and they saw his car sitting out in the parking lot, and he shot himself in the head and killed himself. What a coward. Did that fix the problem? Absolutely not. It made it worse. Made it worse. So some people deal with failures and setbacks in the wrong way, and some deal with it in the right way. All right, very quickly here. Who would you classify as being a helper that got John Mark over the hump as it relates to a failure that he experienced? Paul. But first is Barnabas, of course. And, of course, you can sort of understand the predicament that Barnabas was in, because when they, of course, were fixing to go out on their second missionary journey, because John Mark had turned back on the first missionary journey and didn't continue on with Paul and Barnabas, then Barnabas says, well, let's give him another chance and take him with us. And Paul says, no way. We can't trust him. We can't depend on him. I mean, he's done shown that he's not trustworthy. We can't chance it, him being disloyal to us and going back home again. Was he a young fella? And that's sometimes maybe typical of a young person, doesn't realize what they got themselves into, and so they have a hard time holding out. Well, maybe so. But John Mark was allowed to go with this new missionary journey, that not just Paul and Barnabas, but now two missionary journeys doing the same work, Barnabas and his nephew, John Mark, and, of course, Paul and Silas as another team. Now, ultimately, of course, when you get over to 2 Timothy chapter 4, you see that Paul's attitude towards Mark had changed by that period of time. Of course, it's like 20 years later. He had demonstrated himself to be a capable leader and faithful, and not one that would go back in the work that was to be done. So that was fixed, but the contention was very severe here. And it was a contention over a matter of judgment, okay? Do we all have to agree on matters of judgment? No. That's why they're called matters of judgment. So if we look at that example there, then we see that Barnabas had some good reasons for wanting John to go. We see Paul had some good reasons for not wanting John Mark to go. So they were either both right or they were both wrong. But one of them wasn't right and one of them wasn't wrong. They were both right in their own mind as to the propriety of doing what they did. If we find ourselves in that same situation, then, of course, it's a judgment call, and we don't always have to agree on judgments. Of course, it'd be nice if we could, but sometimes that's not even possible. What did Paul say in Philippians chapter 3 about his past failures? Philippians chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. If somebody gets there, read it, if you would. I'll just put it on the screen so everybody can read it too. All right. So Paul is saying here, I've not yet arrived at where I'm striving to be. I'm still plugging along. I'm still trying. I'm still pushing. I'm still striving. But I'm not going to allow the things that are in the past keep me from doing what I'll be doing now. And that, of course, would be whether it's successes in the past or failures in the past. Had Paul faced failures? I'd say if you're on the receiving end of being stoned to death, that's a failure. That's a pretty significant failure. So he knows what's that about. And he would like to say, you know, I wish these silly Jewish brethren of mine would pay attention to what I'm saying so they wouldn't be trying to kill me. But all of his desire and all of his zeal extended towards those fleshly brothers in Judaism did not remove their antagonism towards him and their desire to kill him, as they were perverting the gospel themselves and preaching a gospel of a different kind, for sure. Oh, me, for sure. If Eliphaz had been counseling poor Paul, to say, Paul, you are the devil incarnate, for sure. You have to be. Look at all that you've faced. Yeah, I know you've been shipwrecked 3 different times. You've been beaten and you've received lashes from rods. I know that you've been in prison. I know what you've faced being without adequate clothing, without adequate food. You know what it's like to be freezing to death and burning up at the same time. You know what it's like to be shipwrecked. You're a sorry scoundrel, there's no doubt. Yeah. It's your own fault. Because you're suffering these things. What can be the result when a person is fearful of being a failure? Hey, that's exactly it. And of course, we've got the classic example in the 25th chapter of the book of Matthew. You got the 1 talent man. Was the 1 talent man looked down upon by the Lord because he was not the 2 talent man? No. Was he looked down upon because he was not the 5 talent man? No. He was looked down upon because he did not use the ability that he had, and thus he hid his talent. And the terminology that's used as the Lord comes back, it says, cast this unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Wait a minute. What terrible thing did he kill anybody? No. Was he guilty of thievery? No. Was he a sexual pervert? No. What was his problem? He just didn't do what he could do. That's it. He just did not do what he had the ability to do. That is a classification of sin, of omission. And of course, most of the time, when we classify sins, commission and omission, well, obviously those commission sins are a whole lot worse than the omission sins. Well, that's not the way the Bible pictures it. Or the Lord's going to have to apologize for his example here, because it sure looks to me like if you're not doing what you can, which is a sin of omission, you're going to end up lost just as much as the thief and idolater is, who's doing things he ain't supposed to be doing. Isn't that something? And when is failure really a success? Well, here again we have the example of the Apostle Paul. He says, the things that were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. You mean all the highfalutin praise that was heaped upon you as you excelled all those that were your contemporaries? Of those his age, he was the top of the top, man. He was up there. But of course, he counted it all as refuse or dung. And then, of course, what's the supreme failure you can suffer? What's a man profit? He gains the whole world and loses his own soul. Yeah. That's it. If you gain anything and everything that the world has to offer, but you end up lost, that is an eternal failure, for sure. Now, be thinking about these, and we'll make Joel answer these next week. What do you think tests people the best, failure or success? That's a good thing to talk about, we will. Looking at the ministry of Jesus, can you argue a good case that he failed? I mean, he came into his own, and his own received him not. That sounds like a failure to me. And then has the church failed in its commission from the Lord to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature? Something to think about. And we'll try to make Joel think about it next week as he leads our thoughts. Thank y'all so much.